Welcome back to the Brothers War EDH. My name is Ryan. This is Chris. We're back at it again with another gameplay video. Thank you so much. We just hit 500 subscribers.
500.
It's been a goal of ours for a long time.
For those who have been following us, they know. Yeah, 500 was a goal for us.
Yeah, I know.
Now we're above 500.
Yeah, just a little bit, you know. I don't know the next goal, but we're just going to just keep on just doing our best here.
Yeah, keep doing it. Keep putting in the work.
Yeah, just want to remind y'all, our Discord is still up. Link is in the description.
Thank you for those who have joined the Discord.
Yeah, no.
It's been fun, honestly.
Yeah,
it's been cool to have that interaction. So, if you're not in the Discord, what are you doing? Why are you not joining the Discord? We have 500 people in our sub.
Yeah.
And we have, what, like 25 maybe?
Yeah, 25, 30.
And a lot of them are some of the brothers that you already know. So, join the Discord now.
Yeah, sorry, Discord. Sorry. Yeah. It's all right. It's all right. Y'all can join if you want to. It is pretty fun in there. So, that's gonna be our Discord, and we also have another announcement.
For those of you who have wanted to do this, we've had plenty of people coming to ask us. We finally have an outlet for you now. We're starting a Patreon. Right now, it's gonna be very minimalistic. We're just gonna have a support tier. But then again, we are going to be increasing those tiers into some perks for you guys. So haven't decided on the logistics of it yet, but we are getting that underway. Got a lot of cool things for you guys, like, as far as maybe being able to play games with us over Spell Table, maybe even be in a game, in a video. So yeah, we got a lot of exciting things coming for you. So yeah, just be on the lookout for that. Yeah, that's about it. Anything else?
Opening hands?
Opening hands?
Kicking us off, we have Ryan on Daretti Scrap Savant. This is a mid-range list that can break parity on stacks pieces from being able to sacrifice them at will, and seeks to win through artifact combos with Staff of Domination, or through dual caster mage lines with Heat Shimmer or Twin Flame to win the game. Next we have Henry on Kess Dissonant Mage. This is a turbo Ad Nauseam deck that seeks to cast Ad Nauseam as early as turns 1 or 2 and win through either Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation or through Underworld Breach lines with Brain Freeze and Lion's Eye Diamond to win the game. Next we have Drew on Brago King Eternal. This is a mid-range list that seeks to control the board early with interaction and win through locking out opponents of resources by being able to infinitely blink Venser or Reality Acid with Brago using Stronic Resonator or Lithoform Engine, and swing with his creatures to win the game. Finally, we have Chris on Hapatra Vizier of Poisons. This is a mid-range list that seeks to win through Infinite Drain either through Witherbloom Apprentice and Chain of Smog, or Yawgmoth and Hapatra with a Zulaport effect and an Undying creature to win the game. And with that, let's go to war. Henry starts off with a pre-game action, putting a Gemstone Caverns into play, exiling a Reanimate. He then passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. Passes to Henry. Henry draws and he plays a Marsh Flats, cracking to good. He had a tapped Blood Crypt. He then passes to Drew. Drew draws and plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He then casts a Mox Diamond, pitching a Henge Gate Pathway. He then passes the turn to Chris. Chris draws and he plays an untapped Overgrown Tomb, taking 2. He then casts a Wild Growth, attaching it to his Overgrown Tomb. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain for turn, then taps 2 to play an Arcane Signet. He then passes to Henry. Henry untaps and draws a card and plays an Underground Sea as his land for turn. He then passes to Drew. Drew draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Spirits. He taps 3 and casts a Narset Parter of Veils and down-ticks Narset, looking at the top 4 cards of his library. He reveals a Path to Exile and puts it into his hand. He then passes the turn to Chris. Chris untaps and then draws a card for his turn. He plays a Plaza of Heroes and he taps 2 to cast Hapatra Vizier of Poisons. He then taps 1 for a green and then casts a Carpet of Flowers. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps and draws a card, playing an Urza Saga as his land for turn. He taps 2 and casts a Grim Monolith, and then taps another 2 to cast a Conspiracy Theorist. He then passes the turn to Henry. Henry draws a card, and he plays a Cephalid Coliseum as his land for turn. and then taps out to cast Kess Dissonant Mage. He then passes the turn to Drew. Drew untaps and draws a card. He then plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn, and taps 4 to cast an uncounterable Brago King Eternal. He then downticks Narset Parter of Veils, looking at the top 4 cards of his library. He reveals a Tangle Wire and puts it into his hand. He then passes the turn to Chris. Chris untaps and draws a card. He targets Henry with Carpet of Flowers and adds 1 black mana, and plays a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth. He uses the black from Henry in 3 to cast a Grim Hireling. He then moves to combat and swings 2 at Ryan. He puts a negative counter on Brago King Eternal and gets a 1/1 Death Touch Snake and 2 treasure tokens. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps and draws for turn, and plays a Gaia Reach Sanitarium as his land for turn and casts his commander, Daretti Scrap Savant. He upticks Daretti and he discards a Memory Jar and a God Pharaoh statue and draws 2 cards, passing the turn to Henry. Henry draws for turn and moves to combat, swinging Kess at Narset Parter of Veils. Drew declares no blocks, and Narset dies, and Henry casts a Time Twister. In response, Chris cracks 2 treasures and taps 1 to cast an Opposition Agent. Time Twister resolves, and everybody shuffles their hands and graveyards into their libraries and draws 7 cards. Henry plays a Flooded Strand and pays 1 life and sacrifices it to look for an island or a plains. But Chris has an Opposition Agent, and Henry has to hand over his deck. And Chris looks through his deck and looks at Henry's hand since he controls Henry while he's searching, and gets a Volcanic Island. Henry then casts a Mox Diamond, and he pitches a Bloodstained Mire. He then casts an Izzet Signet and passes the turn to Drew. Drew untaps. He draws a card and plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He casts a Mana Vault and moves to combat, swinging 1 at Ryan. Ryan takes the 1, and Drew has a trigger on Brago King Eternal, exiling Brago, and then passes the turn to Chris. Chris untaps and then draws a card for his turn. He plays a Gaia's Cradle as his land for turn and uses 1 from the Carpet of Flowers to cast a Luxior Giada's Gift. He then moves to combat, swinging Opposition Agent, Hapatra, and Grim Hireling at Henry, and a 1/1 Death Touch Snake at Drew. On combat damage, Chris puts a -1/-1 counter on Conspiracy Theorist, getting a 1/1 Death Touch Snake, and gets 4 treasure tokens from Grim Hireling. In his second main, he pays a black to sacrifice 4 treasures to Grim Hireling to give Brago -4/-4. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps and draws for his turn, and then hands his deck and hand over to Chris because of Opposition Agent. Chris gets a Currency Converter as his card, and then Ryan plays a Mountain for turn. He then casts a Goblin Engineer, and I'll let y'all hear what happens next.
Oh shoot, I forgot, dude. I forgot too, man.
Chris gets a Staff of Domination off the Goblin Engineer trick. Ryan upticks Daretti and he discards 2 cards. He discards a Grafdigger's Cage and a Treasonous Ogre, drawing 2 cards. Ryan plays a Scalding Tarn for turn and uses the Conspiracy Theorist to cast the Grafdigger's Cage, then taps 5 to cast a Harnfell Horn of Bounty. He then passes the turn to Henry. Henry untaps and draws a card for turn. He plays an Exotic Orchard and taps 3 to cast a Rhystic Study. He taps 2 and dashes out a Ragavan and moves to combat, swinging 2 at Drew. Drew takes 2 and exiles an Arcane Signet off the top of his library. Henry uses the treasure and casts the Arcane Signet and moves to end step, putting the Ragavan that was dashed back into his hand. He then passes the turn to Drew. Drew draws a card, and he plays a Snow-Covered Plains as his land for turn. He then taps 6 to cast Brago King Eternal, taking 2 from the Ancient Tomb. He then passes to Chris. Chris untaps and draws a card for his turn. He plays a Bayou as his land for turn and moves to combat, swinging a Snake at Drew and Henry. They declare no blocks, and Chris makes 4 treasure tokens off the Grim Hireling trigger. Chris moves to his second main and activates Grim Hireling with the mana used from Carpet of Flowers to give Conspiracy Theorist -1/-1 until end of turn. He then casts a Mana Crypt and then taps 2, paying for Rhystic Study to cast the Currency Converter. He casts a Staff of Domination, paying for the Rhystic Study, and passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps and draws a card for his turn. He plays a Mountain as his land for turn and discards a Gemstone Caverns to Hornfell. and exiles the top 2 cards of his library. He exiles a God-Pharaoh statue and a wooded foothills. He discards a treasure vault, exiling the top 2 cards of his library. He gets an underworld breach and a mountain. Sad face. Ryan upticks Daretti, choosing not to discard any cards, and then casts the God-Pharaoh statue, paying for the heuristic study. He then moves to end step, and God-Pharaoh statue will trigger. Each opponent will lose 1 life, and he passes the turn to Henry. Henry untaps and draws a card for his turn. He plays an Underground River. He casts a Ragavan for 3 mana, and then passes the turn to Drew. Drew untaps and then draws a card for his turn. He plays a Snow-Covered Plains as his land for turn, and casts a Jeweled Lotus for 2 mana, taking 2 from the Ancient Tomb. He realizes his Mana Vault shouldn't have untapped on his untap step, and takes 1 damage and taps the Mana Vault. He then moves to combat and swings 2 at Ryan. Ryan declares no blocks, and Drew has a Brago King Eternal trigger, flickering his Brago and his Mana Vault. He then passes the turn to Chris. At the end of turn, Chris taps Gaia's Cradle for 5 green mana, and then activates Currency Converter, drawing a card and discarding a forest into exile. He then uses 2 mana to tap the Staff of Domination to gain 1 life, and then he moves to his turn. Chris untaps and then rolls for Crypt, winning his Mana Crypt trigger. He plays an Emergent Zone as his land for turn, and then moves to combat, swinging Hapatra at Ryan, Opposition Agent and Grim Hireling at Daretti, and then a Snake at Drew and Henry. Everybody declares no blocks, and Chris puts a -1/-1 counter onto the Ragavan, getting a 1/1 Death Touch Snake, and creates 6 treasure tokens with Grim Hireling. In his second main, Chris pays 1 black mana to sacrifice 4 treasures, giving Brago King Eternal -4/-4 until end of turn. He then activates it again, sacrificing another 4 treasures, to give Kess -4/-4 until end of turn. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps and then draws a card for turn. He plays a Luxior Giada's Gift and moves to equip it to Daretti. Ryan upticks Daretti, discarding a Goblin Welder to draw 1 card, and then moves to end step, triggering the God's Pharaoh statue to have his opponents lose 1 life. He then passes the turn to Henry. Henry untaps, draws a card for his turn, looks at his hand, and passes the turn to Drew. Drew moves to untap, and then he draws a card for his turn. He plays a Grafdigger's Cage, and then moves to end step, passing the turn to Chris. On end step, Chris taps Cradle for 6 green mana, and then activates Currency Converter, drawing a card and discarding a Prismatic Vista into exile. He then activates Staff of Domination to draw a card. He then pays 1 mana to untap Staff of Domination, and then taps 5 mana to draw a card again with Staff of Domination. He then moves to his turn. Chris untaps and then has a Mana Crypt trigger, rolling and losing the roll, taking 3 damage. He then draws a card for turn. He plays a City of Brass as his land for turn. He then moves to combat, swinging 1 snake at Drew, 2 snakes at Ryan, and everything else at Henry. Table declares no blocks, and Hapatra puts a -1/-1 counter on the Goblin Engineer. Chris generates a Death Touch Snake and gets 6 treasure tokens. Chris then attempts to resolve a Yawgmoth Thran Physician. Ryan doesn't like this and decides to Tybalt's Trickery in response to the Yawgmoth. Chris then moves to activate Currency Converter to draw a card and discard a card into exile, trying to find an answer. He then discards a Lotus Petal into exile, and Tybalt's Trickery resolves, and Chris mills 1 card. Chris mills a Forbidden Orchard, and then exiles from the top of his library until he exiles a non-land card. He exiles an Agadeem's Awakening, and chooses not to cast it, and puts it on the bottom of his library. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps and draws a card for turn. He discards a Magus of the Moon to Harnfell, exiling the top 2 cards, being Barbarian Ring and a Heat Shimmer. He then moves to sacrifice Barbarian Ring, dealing 2 damage to the Grim Hireling. Chris responds with a Rush Rebirth, targeting his Grim Hireling. Drew casts a Negate, targeting the Rushed Rebirth. Negate resolves, and Ryan's Barbarian Ring kills the Grim Hireling. Ryan taps 3 mana for a Heat Shimmer, and then holds priority, casting a Dual Caster Mage, targeting the Heat Shimmer, not paying for the heuristic study. With Dualcaster Mage targeting the Heat Shimmer, you can create another Dualcaster Mage, entering the battlefield, copying the Heat Shimmer, to make another Dualcaster Mage, copying the Heat Shimmer, etc., 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 making infinite Dualcaster Mages to swing out and win the game. However, Chris decides he wants to let the first one resolve and then responds to the second activation. Chris casts a Tail Swipe targeting his Snake and the newly targeted Dualcaster Mage. Tail Swipe resolves, and Ryan gets a Goblin Engineer in which he decides not to search his library. Ryan then moves to combat, swinging 3 at Chris. Chris takes 3, and at the end of turn, Ryan exiles his tokens and triggers Godpharaoh statue to have his opponents take 1. Henry draws a card for his turn, and then plays a Wooded Foothills as his land for turn. He then casts a Grim Monolith, passing to turn to Drew. Drew untaps, takes 1 from the Mana Vault, and draws a card for his turn. He plays an Academy Ruins as his land for turn, and casts Brago King Eternal. He then passes the turn to Chris. Chris untaps for his turn, and then has a Mana Crypt trigger on upkeep, rolling, and losing the die roll, taking 3 damage. He then draws a card for his turn. Chris plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then moves to combat, swinging Hapatra, Opposition Agent, and all of his snakes at Henry for 8 damage. Henry declares no blocks, and Chris puts a -1/-1 counter on the Goblin Engineer, and generates a 1/1 Death Touch Snake. He then activates Currency Converter using the mana that Henry gave Chris from the Carpet of Flowers to draw and discard a Marsh Flats into exile. He then passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan untaps for his turn and draws a card. He upticks Daretti, choosing not to discard any cards, and discards a Red Elemental Blast to Hornfell, exiling the top 2 cards, exiling a Sensei's Divining Top and a Mountain. He plays the Mountain for his land for turn, and then casts Sensei's Divining Top. He then moves to activate Top, looking at the top 3 cards, rearranging them in any order, and then moves to end step, triggering the Godpharaoh statue to deal 1 damage to his opponents. He then passes the turn to Henry. Henry untaps and then draws a card for his turn. He plays a Forbidden Orchard as his land for turn, and then taps out to cast Kess Dissonant Mage, giving Drew a Spirit token with Forbidden Orchard. He then passes to Drew. Drew untaps, takes 1 from the Mana Vault, and then draws a card for his turn. He plays a Draneth Magistrate, and then moves to combat, swinging 2 damage at Ryan. Ryan declares no blocks, and Drew flickers Brago and his Mana Vault, and then passes the turn to Chris. At the end of turn, Chris taps Gaia's Cradle for 6 green mana, and uses 3 mana to cast a Deadly Rollick targeting Kess. Deadly Rollick resolves, and Kess is exiled into the command zone. Chris then uses the remaining 3 mana and another 2 to pay for Rhystic and cast Worldly Tutor. He searches up a Craterhoof Behemoth to the top of his library and activates Staff of Domination to draw the Craterhoof Behemoth. He then moves to his turn. Chris untaps for his turn, and then upkeep trigger of Mana Crypt has him roll to lose 3 life. Chris draws a card for his turn and plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then casts a Craterhoof Behemoth, and in response, Henry casts a Rain of Filth. He starts to sacrifice his lands, including Wooded Foothills, Forbidden Orchard, and Underground River to generate 3 black mana. He casts a Cabal Ritual, getting 5 black mana, and then pays 1 to sacrifice the Cephalid Coliseum to draw 3 cards, and discard 3 cards, discarding a Mana Confluence, Ancient Tomb, and Felwar Stone. He then pays 4 mana to untap his Grim Monolith and passes priority. Drew responds and casts a Counterspell targeting the Craterhoof Behemoth. Counterspell resolves, and Chris moves to combat. He swings Hapatra and Opposition Agent at Henry, and 4 1/1 Death Touch Snakes at Ryan. On combat damage, Chris puts a -1/-1 counter onto the Spirit, and gets a 1/1 Death Touch Snake. He then passes to Ryan. At the end of turn, Ryan untaps his Grim Monolith, and then moves to his turn, untapping and then drawing a card. He then activates Sensei's Divining Top, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, rearranging them in any order, and then activates Top, putting the top on top and drawing a card. And he casts a Big Score, discarding a Mountain to draw 2 cards and make 2 treasure tokens. He then casts the Sensei's Divining Top. He then moves to activate Top, looking at the top 3 cards, putting them in any order, and upticks Daretti, discarding a Direfleet Daredevil, drawing 1 card. He then passes the turn to Drew. Drew untaps for his turn and draws a card. He casts a Wandering Archaic, and then he moves to combat, swinging 2 at Ryan. On combat damage, Drew flickers his Mana Vault and Brago and passes the turn to Chris. At the end of turn, Chris activates the Currency Converter to draw a card and discard a Mox Amber into exile. He then activates the Staff of Domination to draw a card. He then moves to his turn. Chris untaps and rolls for Mana Crypt, taking 3 damage. He draws a card for his turn and invokes Endurance, exiling an Elves of the Deep Shadow. Endurance resolves and he targets himself, putting the cards on the bottom of his library in a random order. He then casts a Diabolic Intent, sacrificing a snake. Diabolic Intent resolves and he searches his library for a card and puts it in his hand. He then casts a Yawgmoth Thran Physician. Yawgmoth resolves and Chris pays 1 life, sacrificing a Death Touch Snake to put a -1/-1 counter on Wandering Archaic and drawing a card. He then casts a Worldly Tutor. In response, Ryan activates Top, looking at the top 3 cards, putting them back in any order, and passes priority to Drew. Drew casts a Flusterstorm with a storm count of 4, and all the copies are targeting Worldly Tutor. Chris lets it resolve, and Worldly Tutor is counters. Chris then starts to put -1/-1 counters on his opponent's creatures by paying a life, sacrificing a snake, and putting a -1/-1 counter on a creature, triggering Hapatra. Every time you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, you get a 1/1 Death Touch Snake. This is effectively a one-sided board wipe, while drawing cards equal to the life total. Chris then taps 5 mana and casts an Obelisk Spider. Now as Chris goes through the loop with Yawgmoth and Hapatra, Obelisk Spider will net him 0 life. That means he can do this as many times as he wants, equal to the number of toughness on the battlefield as he chooses. Chris drains the table down, killing Drew, and then moves to combat, swinging everything at Ryan. Ryan takes everything and goes down to 1, and Chris triggers Hapatra, putting a -1/-1 counter on his snake to deal the final blow. And that is the game. Good game, boys.
What a grindy game there. Yeah. First CDH game is a nice little grind.
Yeah, no.
Got the dub, you know. Hapatra always coming in clutch for me. But, you know, I think that the pivotal point of the game was definitely the tail swipe on Ryan's Dualcaster Mage. That's what really sprung me to win the game. I had already went for a win attempt, and so it was a good choice for Ryan to go for it there. Yep. If I didn't have removal, that was game. So I think that was definitely a pivotal point. Yeah. Had my second win attempt stop with Craterhoof Behemoth. Then I finally managed to get the 3rd win attempt through. Surprising, Henry's Turbo deck didn't blast out a Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation. But as you saw in the opening hands, he didn't really have much going for him. He had a turn 3 Rhystic Study, turn 2 Rhystic Study or something like that. But, you know, by that time, everybody was able to pay. He wasn't able to get off of the ground. But, yeah, that was a grindy game. It was a really good game. Yeah. If you can notice the mistake that we made at the end of the game, that could have closed it out a little bit faster.
Yeah. It could have.
Let us know in the comments if you can catch what happened.
Yeah. That you know, the game was good. Basically, having you know, Chris was just controlling everyone's board really for a while too during that game. Like, you know, Brago died maybe like 20 times. Yeah, so it's like
Grim Hireling's a great card when you're making when you're going against 4 toughness creatures. And you're making 6 treasures, 4 to 6 treasures a turn off your Death Touch Snakes. Yeah, that's nice to be able to just.
You don't want to block them.
Well, yeah, you're not going to block them with your guys, and then you get the Grim Hireling to take out Kess and Brago. I mean, Grim Hireling's a great card. People should be running it more, I think.
Yeah, but, worst play of the game was obviously that Goblin Engineer on the.
On the, worst play of the game, Goblin Engineer into the opposition aid. There were so many missed. I think that
you just don't think about it though, because if you don't play CDH often, and if you don't see that card often, you're like, oh yeah, you're subconscious like, yeah, I'm just gonna go tutor for this. I'm gonna fetch lane for this. Like, no, give me your deck.
Yeah, you really.
There's a Saga. I also got caught by that too. Well, I mean,
got caught.
That came in. That came in after.
Yeah, that came in after. So. Yeah. I don't know. Hey, that was a great game. If you happen to like this content, we enjoyed doing first CDH gameplay. It was something we've been wanting to do for a long time. If you happen to enjoy it, make sure you like, subscribe, sub, comment, tell us why you hate us, tell us why you love us.
Remember the Patreon, remember the Discord. We'll see y'all there too.
Yeah, we'll see you there. And I hope you enjoyed everything, and we'll see you guys later.